Welcome back, Rankers. Happy New Year. Happy 2012. Hopefully you can hear me over the rain this morning. It is absolutely bucketing down. You thought I was going to say something else, didn't you? But I wasn't. Keeping it clean. Every year, at the beginning of the year, I usually make a couple of predictions. A couple of years ago, I said Twitter was going to be big. Last year, I said that expect more attacks on online freedoms. We certainly saw that in 2011. The attacks on WikiLeaks, the new legislation that came out in at least 3 countries and probably more on the whole 3 strikes and you're out. Basically, if you get caught downloading copyrighted material 3 times, then your internet connection is gone. And I don't mean it just drops out. I mean you're off the internet. That's it. You're not allowed. You've abused it. And most of that legislation, according to WikiLeaks, I said WikiLeaks. According to WikiLeaks, came out of the US, where the big copyright holders and the government were sponsoring or helping draft this legislation. Certainly that was the case with Spain, as demonstrated by US cables. And right now, as we speak, the Stop Online Piracy Act is getting a lot of traction in the US, and they're trying to get it passed, which basically, it's a pretty horrible piece of legislation. Basically, it gives the government power to say, oh, no, that website's illegal, take it down. Now, however, last year, the US government did that anyway with, there was several websites that they just basically took the domain names away from and said that, no, you're doing illegal activity, you can't have that domain name anymore, we're taking it back. And no, there was no recourse for the domain name owners. Basically, those sites just disappeared. Now they're trying to enshrine that sort of behaviour in legislation. But to the credit, the internet community is fighting back. And a big shout out to the people at Reddit and the members of Reddit. They have basically changed one big sponsor of this act. They've changed their mind. They seem to have changed their mind anyway. GoDaddy, who is one of the world's largest domain name sellers, basically came out supporting this legislation. The Reddit users decided to, right, everyone, let's move our domain names away from GoDaddy to another provider. They did so, and within days, GoDaddy basically backtracked on their position of support for the legislation because they lost basically thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars overnight, who knows how much. So I think this year we're going to see more online activism than we've seen before, and certainly there is no greater example of that than what's happening right now in the US. The US Republican presidential race right now going on is the Iowa Caucus. So I want to have a bit of a look at the Iowa Caucus and show you what we're seeing in Google Insights for search, and also a little bit about what's happening in Twitter for real-time search. Now, we did this 4 years ago during the US presidential election, and what we learned was that searches do always correspond to what's happening in the news for a candidate. And we saw that, you know, Ron Paul, and if I show you this over the last 4 years, you'll see what I mean. And Ron Paul is a libertarian candidate, and I'm a libertarian, so yeah, I agree with a lot of the stuff that he says, but not everything. So if we look at it over the last, oh sorry, I've done that the wrong way, 2004 till present. And what I've got here is Ron Paul, Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum, Michelle Bachmann, Newt Gingrich, and I'm doing all of these searches to get a comparison for the search volumes of each of those names. So you can see here back in 2007 a real spike for Ron Paul, but it did not equate to winning at the polls. So we know that, right? The only difference I would say here, and even just prior to the US federal election, where he was already out of the race, he was spiking as well. So, but what we learned then is that news items would also correspond to search. So the more news that you got, and if I had John McCain in here, you would see who was the guy who won the Republican nomination 4 years ago. You would see his search traffic start to spike, and it would correlate to news items. So let's go back to the last 90 days. We can see once again that Ron Paul is certainly getting the most searches. And when we switch on news headlines, it doesn't have it here, but I believe, I believe this spike here was, it says here New York Times, but there was also an appearance on the Jay Leno Tonight Show. Back here we've got the Republican debate, and we can see there's various spikes happening here as well. And right down here we're seeing this Rick Santorum start to surge, as they like to say at the moment. They're saying that Rick Santorum is surging in the polls, and it's his moment in the spotlight. Rick Santorum, from what I can see, hates a lot of stuff, including certain types of citizens. So he seems to be have a lot of pent-up antagonisms. But apparently he's surging in the polls. And certainly we can see here in the last 48 hours he has seems to have surged in the polls. And we can see here from Thursday, 29th of December, he's starting to get more searches, dipped, and then he's come back again today. But once again, we can see this does actually correlate to some sort of news item. And what Google is saying the news item is most relevant to this latest search volume spike is actually a video from one of his opponents, Rick Perry, who says that Rick Santorum is unelectable. So, search volume does not necessarily correspond to good results, if you like, or they could actually be searching for things that are terrible. But you can see there that Ron Paul, once again, he has the most active online supporter base out of any of these candidates. In fact, if you go and have a look at any online poll for the US Republican debate, you will see that Ron Paul will win every one of them. And that's because his supporter base is so active online. And to give you an example of that, Kelly Clarkson, the American Idol winner from a couple of years ago, she came out and said that she really liked Ron Paul. That was all she said on Facebook. And what happened was is that the Ron Paul supporters actually organised what they call a music bomb. And basically that means that they all decided to go and buy her single or her album for $1.50 or whatever it was. And if we have a look here, we put Ron Paul in that search, you'll see the articles. But basically, you know, she made a couple of comments and it doubled her sales. She went to #1 overnight. So that's how this Ron Paul supporters are very active online and how they organise online and how they bring things together. They were doing the same thing 4 years ago, but there seems to be a lot more of them now, and certainly far more organised. Now, Mashable has got an article today saying that, what about Twitter mentions? If your Twitter mentions are up, does it correlate to what actually happens in the voting in the polls? And what they've got here is a comparison graph between an NBC poll and what they say is positive sentiment on Twitter. Now, this is where I have an issue in the difference between, say, Twitter and Google, is that Twitter is about real-time, what's happening now, and Google is about this is what's happening as a trend, if you like, when you're talking about Google Insights for search. This is what people are doing when they're researching. Twitter, for me, is what people are doing when they're chatting. I think there's less research done on Twitter because it is, it's so transient. And when people research, they go to Google, and we've shown that time and time again over the last year when we've looked at things like social media campaigns and how then they get researched in Google. So I do have a problem with this concept of positive sentiment on Twitter. Like, for instance, this Rick Santorum, who seems fairly offensive, I've got to say. What's the difference between someone saying, sure, Rick Santorum would make a fine US president, as opposed to, sure, Rick Santorum would make a fine US president. They're two completely different things. And these sentiment engines have a real problem with sarcasm. So I wouldn't rely on them if I was you. If you were looking at, well, we need to look at sentiment around our brand. Let's have a look at Twitter. Certainly, you can go and look at some certain keywords, but and even context. But trying to ascertain from a piece of software whether that's sarcasm or not, I don't think we're there yet. And if, for instance, you go and do a search for Rick Santorum or Ron Paul, I've got a search here for Ron Paul, and we can see that Rick Santorum's getting mentioned as well, but he's getting mentioned because Rick Santorum's nephew is endorsing Ron Paul, his competitor. So those sorts of things are a little sketchy in my point of view. What's going to happen in Iowa? Well, we will know in the next few hours, and I'll be very interested to watch to see what happens on Twitter. Certainly, whoever wins that Iowa caucus, their name is going to trend like crazy on Twitter, and then you'll see a corresponding spike in the next couple of days in search volume. The only thing that I think that we can really tell when it comes to elections about what's happening is that certainly there are more people interested in researching this guy than, say, there are this guy down here. That's really all you can say from that. But what you do notice is that when one of these gets more press than the other, you will see more search volumes. And we haven't actually seen another news item which should be in around here about Rick Santorum, and that was that yesterday, or in the last 48 hours at least, Rupert Murdoch came out and said Rick Santorum is the man for him. Interesting. And that's what comes up, but you can't tell anything, I don't think, from any of these searches except what people are more interested in right now. How they vote is a totally different thing. We'll know in a couple of hours, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.